This is one of my favorite paintings by Soutine entitled Chemin de la Fontaine d'Autun et la Carat, or The Path to the Fountain in Carat. Soutine was in this particular town in France where he had a very productive period, but ended up destroying most of his works from this time. He depicted the landscape mostly. He had moved away from portraiture, from the figure, from various still lifes, such as the hunks of meat, which were inspired by Rembrandt. And here he's going for as pure of a landscape as you can in the French countryside. There is a difference between the North American painters, such as the Group of Seven, who are dealing with untouched or quote unquote wild nature, and the nature present in the European continent. There's housing, there's development. But here you have a very interesting time for painting in particular as a work of art in the 1920s. You have the birth of at least the inklings of abstract expressionism, and Soutine would later inspire such painters, in particular de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, for obvious reasons, especially in this work. Now, here you see the typical hallmarks of the collapsing of the picture plane. You have a variety of marks and strokes that are done almost in a trance-like or chaotic fashion, or what people would think. But there is a lot of deliberation in terms of the way you layer various chunky and painterly broken color strokes onto the canvas. I'm assuming that he's mixing just by the nature of looking at these various brushstrokes. He's mixing on the canvas to achieve a level of broken color that cannot be had just by deliberate mixing and color matching and so forth. He's doing this very intuitively. I'm assuming he had a few sketches that he would do out in the countryside and then go back to the studio and do this. He is not exactly a plein air painter. He very much has the spirit of a quote unquote modern artist, as opposed to a plein air artist who is doing, in some ways, a technical craft or treating the work of art as a rugged technical craft by going out into nature and trying to capture the light directly. Here you have the typical collapse of the picture plane that was taken to its extremes and logical conclusions in the works of, people like Pollock and de Kooning. You have the pathway right in the middle, violating a lot of the, unwritten rules of landscape painting. You have not the illusion of depth, but rather depth that comes from comparing various chaotic strokes next to each other that denote things like trees and foliage. But this is very surface. And typically with Soutine, you have this melting of the landscape, this final blow to realism, but retaining realism nevertheless, or retaining a spirit of something there, an impression or an imprint of a building or a tree or a pathway to a fountain. In this, Soutine collapses the distinction between the horizon line, the sky, the forest, and the man-made object. They are melting into one, kind of like ice cream melted together, as Robert Hughes said in his documentary Shock of the New. We have a quote here from an art critic that very much in some ways runs counter to the analysis of Robert Hughes in some ways. We have John Berger in Another Way of Seeing. This is from the 2002 issue of Harper's Magazine. He said, Soutine was among the greatest painters of the 20th century. It has taken 50 years for this to become clear, because his art was both traditional and uncouth. And this mixture offended all fashionable tastes. It was as if his painting had a heavy, broken accent and was considered inarticulate, at best exotic and at worst barbarian. Now his devotion to the existent becomes more and more exemplary. Few other painters have revealed more graphically than he the collaboration implicit in the act of painting between model and painter. The poplars, the carcasses, the children's faces on Soutine's canvases cling to his brush. So Soutine really much is this sort of mad half beast between the modern and the ancient. He's doing a very old form of art. He's doing a landscape, which by the time you have the interwar period, you have the advance of very late stage modernism in Europe, this was almost unthinkable. This style of painting was sort of passé. And you have various experiments within conceptual art, within painting taking a back seat to performance and so forth. Later on, painting would come again, but it would come again in New York, or rather, not even in New York, but rather in Seattle, in various places, the Northwestern School, in places like Canada, then later New York, reaching its crescendo. Painting goes away, comes back in the 80s. Painting will always sort of be dethroned as the apex of quote-unquote fine art, and always will come back eventually. But Soutine was doing something radically out of time, even though he inspired the quote-unquote later modernists. So Soutine was doing the landscape the way in which your pure sensuous reality would depict it, your immediate impression as a haze of chaos and foliage, rather than something that is calculated like a lot of the high Renaissance landscapes going into Impressionism. Impressionism still retained form. In fact, they purported to retain pure form, but rather Soutine violates this by saying that when you look at nature itself, when you go back to the things themselves, form now becomes a haphazard ensemble of gestural strokes. It becomes something that is melting. It becomes something that within the eye of the artist, within that immediate chaotic impression, encounter with the subject, it is something that cannot be delineated by the mind's eye immediately. You have to almost trick the mind's eye into depicting the landscape the way that this immediacy would have you. But it's not the immediacy of a plein air painter. It's the immediacy of the artist's eye itself. The plein air painter likes to think that they've captured an immediacy, but there's a lot of calculations that aid the plein air painter in their pursuit of trying to capture the light, trying to capture a scene. They're doing studies and so forth. They are working or embellishing certain features. They usually have a formula, a way of approaching a certain landscape in order to depict it in a timely manner. But what Soutine is doing is very similar to, I would say, with color and form, the Chinese landscape painters. This is an intuitive encounter. It's not something that is done on site. It is something that is effervescent. So then Soutine, of course, he has a very, I would say, shaky, wavering, uncertain approach to form itself within the work of art. Because, of course, he grew up in a Hasidic household. He very much had an Enconist upbringing where the form of something, the actual image itself, was not encouraged. So the image was sublated with what some would say is a quote-unquote libidinal quality. It is something that is on the undercurrents, something that is, quote, in this one article, with portraits he seems to have locked libido-wise onto certain parts of the sitter environment, to have a diminished others. Faces and bodily portraitures become uncanny, but backgrounds are often muddy and messy, and hands can be almost comical. Touchman and Donau blow up two-hand details on impact, out of respect, I suspect. The fingers look like careless swipes or like deranged worms attempting to take off, but the face is still retained, the spirit of the face. The dualities are part of Soutine's essence, a more physically driven painter than even Jackson Pollock. He seems to have worked in a frenzied semi-trance attached to his existent, like certain American Indian initiatives were attached to hooks through the chests on the sun. When Soutine is on, he produces paintings that are pastichical, semi-metamorphic, absurd, brilliant, pungent, unforgettable. He is having this shaky relationship to form and color and object because in some ways he's going at it blindly. In some ways he does not develop, only later on, a very sophisticated approach to the rules of painting and color and tone and so forth. He is expressing an immediacy, and it's very much an innocent form of abstraction, unlike the calculated form of abstraction that comes later with painters like Rothko in particular. So this has been a great illustration in how the work of art and how the landscape in particular can become liberated from form. So that is why Soutine is one of the greatest landscape painters in the closing of Impressionism, the opening up of the late modernists, and even into abstract expressionism and the death of the avant-garde. Soutine is really a major crossover jump-off point. So if you liked my analysis, please support me. There will be more of these exclusively to Patreon, patreon.com/GiantArtProductions. If you wish to make a one-time donation, I have a PayPal link, paypal.me, in the bio. Please like, share, and subscribe. For every Monday, another installment of Monday Modern Art Madness. God bless and goodbye.